Good morning, everyone. I'm Steve McDonald, the Director of the Africa Program and the Project on Leadership and Building State Capacity here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. I want to welcome you on this beautiful day. I know it's probably pretty hard to come inside when you could be outside, so we appreciate you being here. Welcome you on behalf of Jane Harmon, our President, who can't be with us this morning, but might be able to drop by later, so we'll see if she is able to do that. The Wilson Center, as you probably know, was, of course, established by Congress in 1968 as a living memorial to President Woodrow Wilson. We are very, very proud to be a part of this week of the Secretary of State's Strategic Dialogue with Civil Society. We heartily welcome this initiative. In fact, I think I said to Augusta Babson, if she's here in the room, that, well, it's about time, because many of us in the NGO community have been hoping for some kind of a formula for working with civil society and partnership with the government. Wilson Center is, of course, civil society. We have a long history of partnership with the government and advocacy for increased USG civil society partnerships in areas of mutual concern. This principle, in fact, is at the heart of the Wilsonian philosophy on which we were founded. That is, in bringing together the world of ideas, scholarship, field practitioners, and et cetera, with the world of policy, government. I represent the Africa program and the leadership project, as I just said, and we have worked closely with USAID, State Department, AFRICOM, the Congress, many other government entities. But my role here is as a representative of the Woodrow Wilson Center. We in fact, program after program here are working closely with the government as partners, whether it's our program on international security studies, the Kennan Institute on Russia and former Soviet states, the Kissinger Institute on China, our Middle East program, our North Korean documentation project, the Nuclear Proliferation International History Project, our program on America and the global economy, Science and Technology Innovation Project, China Environmental Forum, the Cold War International History Project, the Congress Project, our Council on Women World Leaders, working very closely with Milan Ferrer, or the Environmental Change and Security Program. We all interact with and partner with, inform, and engage USG entities on the issues in which we are focused. For instance, later this year, in a project in partnership with USAID, our Environmental Change and Security Project and the Africa Program will be launching a major project on climate change adaptation to engage the Africa Union Economic Commission for Africa, including the Africa Climate Policy Center and strategically chosen research institutes in Africa who have done in-depth studies on this issue for an awareness-building campaign with the policy community here and a lessons learned compilation for implementing more effective adaptation policies on the ground in Africa. Today we will have a scene setter by the Secretary's newly appointed Senior Advisor for Civil Society and Emerging Democracies, Tomika Tillman. And that's going to be followed by short presentations, which will look at the 5 key issues being covered by the Strategic Dialogue with Civil Society working groups. Those are democracy and human rights, women's empowerment, governance and accountability, labor, and religion and foreign policy. These presenters I'm happy to say, because I like the mix, are a good mix of government and civil society representatives. Now, Dr. Tillman, I'm not going to give full bios because you have those before you, but as you know, Dr. Tillman is the Senior Advisor for Civil Society and Emerging Democracies, and he was most recently a speechwriter for the Secretary and worked in Senate Foreign Relations Committee as a special advisor to then Chairman Joe Biden. I'm going to go ahead and give a very brief introduction of the speakers, because what I'll ask is after Dr. Tillman has spoken, then they will just get up and make their brief presentations in their areas in a row, and then we will open up to questions and answers. We're trying to make this brief in terms of the formal presentation so we can have a good exchange with you. I would remind you that we're being webcast live, and so when we get to the questions and answers, please wait for a microphone to be delivered before you ask your questions, and please identify yourselves for the camera. So the first speaker after Dr. Tillman has finished will be Scott Busby, who's the Director of the Office of Multilateral and Global Affairs in the Bureau of Democracy, Rights, and Labor at the U.S. Department of State. The second speaker will be Chris Sipple, who's President of the Institute for Global Engagement. And then Elise Nelson, who's President, CEO, and founder of the Vital Voices Global Partnership. And finally, Lisa Schurch, who is Director of 3P Human Security. So with no further ado, Dr. Tillman, if you'd like to address us.
Well, let me thank you, Steve, for that very kind introduction. I appreciate it. It is a special pleasure to be here today at the Wilson Center, which is an organization that has done so much to bridge the divide between civil society and government throughout its existence. And we are delighted to have the Wilson Center as a partner in our 2012 summit of our strategic dialogue with civil society. I'd like to begin today by asking you all to think about some of the extraordinary changes that we witnessed last year. At the beginning of the year, there was a government in place in Egypt that was a very stable government. Certainly, if you believed the experts, it wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. It had been in place for 3 decades, and yet over the course of 18 days, we saw changes unfold that completely recontoured the political landscape of a country of 80 million people and left us, frankly, in a very different world. Let's look beyond Egypt and look at Tunisia. 1 month before the changes transpired in Egypt, we witnessed similar events in Tunisia, where you had a government that had been in place almost as long, in this case 23 years, and was one of the most efficient authoritarian regimes anywhere in the world. But in the space of just a few weeks, we saw events unfold that took that country in a radically different direction that virtually no one had anticipated. Let's zoom back a little bit further and look at the last decade, at the phenomenon of climate change, and at the movement that has risen around the world to push governments to take steps that they never would have considered on their own. We've seen analogous activities surrounding global health, where extraordinary energy has been diverted to address problems like HIV, AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. In each case, these are steps that government would not have arrived at on its own. And finally, if we look back a little bit further, 2 decades, to the collapse of communism, we saw one of the most powerful empires the world has ever seen washed away down the river of history. Now, as we consider these rather extraordinary events, each of them, we find a common denominator. And that common denominator is, of course, civil society. And I realize that this audience is very well acquainted with the term, but I want to spend just a moment discussing what civil society is and how these seemingly disconnected events come together into something that is increasingly an integral element of our foreign policy. The world is facing a period of extraordinary change. We are witnessing unprecedented advances in technology and shifts in culture, and together these are generating a fundamental renegotiation in the power relationships that have historically defined interactions between individuals and government. And the influence of these changes are allowing groups beyond the state to have an extraordinary impact. And certainly the geopolitical earthquakes that we've witnessed in North Africa, the Middle East, Russia, and other countries over the last year provide strong evidence of this phenomenon. And as that trend continues, we are going to witness the emergence of a new set of relationships between governments, citizens, and civil society organizations. Now, of course, civil society isn't new, and the phenomenon of individuals coming together to take collective action for a greater cause is not new. If we look at the United States, at our own history, we find that civil society brought us our own independence over 200 years ago. It led to the abolition of slavery. It led to the spread of women's rights, civil rights, environmental protections, labor rights. So this is a phenomenon that has certainly been an integral component of our national identity and our history throughout our existence as a nation. But the global phenomenon of civil society is expanding very rapidly. In terms of its size and influence on the rest of the world, civil society is exploding. If you look at conservative estimates that come from yearbooks, you find that in 1990 there were about 6,000 international organizations, civil society organizations, tracked by yearbooks. And now we're up to about over 60,000 international civil society organizations. Their ranks continue to grow quickly, and the rate of change that is occurring as a result of actions by civil society is increasing along with this. And technological change, as I mentioned, is making it easier and cheaper than it's ever been before for individuals to come together around common interests and take common action to serve the common good. So what does this mean for those of us engaged in diplomacy? How does this impact the way we do business? What does it mean when we have to start thinking about engaging the world and conducting diplomacy, not in rooms like this, which is the Ben Franklin room at the State Department, where coincidentally we held yesterday's opening event of the Strategic Dialogue with Civil Society, but in settings like this? And what does it mean when the targets of our diplomacy are no longer individuals like these guys, but these guys? How does that affect the way we reach out to the world? Well, the first thing we need to do is recognize that this is a monumental challenge. This is something that's not going to happen quickly, and it's not going to happen without some real effort. And for that reason, we are fortunate that Secretary Clinton initiated a process that will be familiar, I expect, to many of you brave enough to attend an event that begins with an acronym. You know you're speaking to a very select crowd in this case. But Secretary Clinton initiated a process called the Quadrennial Diplomacy and Development Review. I encourage all of you to try to say that 5 times fast. And this was a top-to-bottom reevaluation of everything we do at the State Department. We looked at every bureau, every office, every initiative, and tried to figure out how it fits into the broader trajectory of our diplomacy. And one of the key findings of this Quadrennial Diplomacy and Development Review was that we need to do more to reach out to partners beyond the state. The QDDR specifically identified a need to build bridges with actors outside of government, who, as we've discussed, are playing this vital and increasingly important role in our foreign policy. So we began from that point working initially with international organizations, starting with the Community of Democracies, which many of you will recognize as an organization that brings together governments and civil society around the goal of strengthening democracy and provides civil society with an equal seat at the table. And Secretary Clinton went to a meeting of the Community of Democracies in Krakow and delivered a keynote address on the centrality of civil society in our foreign policy. Now, keep in mind, this was in the summer of 2010, 6 months before anyone had thought of the term Arab Spring. And so this, fortunately, is a case where, give the Secretary a tremendous amount of credit, she was far ahead of the curve. And then, within the QDDR, again, long before some of the events that I mentioned earlier in my remarks unfolded, we announced that we would be launching an effort called the Strategic Dialogue with Civil Society. Now, a strategic dialogue, as many of you will know, is the equivalent of laying down a diplomatic superhighway between two capitals. And this is a tool that we use with our most important bilateral partners. And up until this initiative, it had only been utilized with our most important bilateral partners, countries like India, Pakistan, China, and Russia. And it sets up a regular series of high-level meetings on the full spectrum of issues where we are engaged as a State Department. And for the first time in February of last year, we launched a strategic dialogue with a partner outside of government, with civil society. And Secretary Clinton came together with activists from around the world. Here you see her with Sharif Mansour, who was a leader in the Egyptian democracy movement, and started identifying areas of common concern where we could work together and identify opportunities for progress. We have continued this process in meetings around the world and through the creation of 5 working groups, as you heard earlier from Steve, and we're going to hear more about the activities of each of those working groups today. And those working groups have, over the course of the last year, generated concrete policy recommendations directly from civil society. And yesterday, in an event attended by representatives of civil society from 40 countries and broadcast to an audience of many thousands around the world, Secretary Clinton announced action on all 8 of the first recommendations that have emerged from this process. They're going to allow us to do a wide variety of tasks that will expand our engagement with civil society and help us address issues where we have common ground with our partners in this sector. I'll let my colleagues who are speaking on behalf of the working groups touch on those deliverables in greater detail, and we can talk about them in the question and answer. But one that I'll mention briefly is the expansion of this process from Washington-based working groups that have been led by our undersecretaries, assistant secretaries, and ambassadors at large and special representatives out to the embassy level. And we are going to be beginning with the creation of 10 new embassy-level working groups for civil society that will allow activists in the field the same opportunity to feed into this process and channel recommendations to the Secretary. And we know, on the basis of this experience, that we can see some extraordinary results. We've already had instances where recommendations from civil society have had a direct impact on the way that we are providing support in countries that are undergoing democratic transitions. And we are seeing civil society emerge as a critical element in the way that we formulate policy, not only in historic areas of strength where we've had strong relationships with civil society, and certainly Scott Busby and our Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor are one example of a bureau that has always understood the importance of this work, but across the State Department. Secretary Clinton is fond of speaking of civil society as one of the three legs of the stool that supports a successful nation, along with government, the private sector, and the private sector. And we understand that by reaching out to civil society, we can ensure that our diplomacy is balanced and addresses the need to strengthen each of those three legs of the stool in partner countries. But beyond that, civil society does something that those other sectors cannot accomplish. Civil society, we know from a generation of social science research, is where we generate trust as we come together across divides of religion and political ideology in order to work together toward common goals. We're able to replenish that reservoir of trust that irrigates everything we do in every other aspect of our nations. And by virtue of replenishing that reservoir of trust, we are able to make progress not only on individual issues, but across the full spectrum of topics where we are engaged. So we feel that the opportunity to strengthen civil society is something that's not only important as it relates to each of the individual topics that we'll be discussing today, but also as it relates to our broader efforts to build strong relationships, not only with governments, but between people. And ultimately, we know that strategic partnership with the citizens of other countries is as important as any strategic relationship we have. There are few sure bets in the world of foreign policy, but one of them, in my view, is that this trend is going to continue, that we will see civil society increasingly playing a vital role in the work of diplomacy. And we are delighted today, again, to have this opportunity to hear from all of you, many of whom I know are in civil society, about how we can move through this process together. This is uncharted territory. We've been engaged in diplomacy with governments for millennia, but this is comparatively very, very new terrain, and we're looking forward to mapping it together with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Tomika. A very good scene setter. Before Scott comes forward, I'm just reminded that it might be instructive here that one of the major, in the area that I'm most focused on and most knowledgeable about, that is Africa, the role of civil society has been the game changer. What most people don't realize is they look at the Africa of today where there's immense growth opportunity and return on investment and a lot of excitement about what's going on in the continent, that 1990, 91, 92, after the end of the Cold War, was the real transitional period when you had national conventions and opening up a democratic space. But what happened, of course, was finally in that continent the growth of civil society. where it hadn't really been present anywhere outside of South Africa, which was an anti-apartheid civil society. So the burgeoning civil society across the continent has really made the difference. In these last 20 years has shown a real turnaround in Africa in terms of its role in the global village. So, Scott.
Thanks, Steve. Well, I think Tamaika has wonderfully set the scene for sort of more granular remarks that each of us will have on specifically what the working groups we're in charge of are doing, as well as what our overall work on civil society is about. As Tamaika mentioned, civil society has been a long-standing concern of our Bureau, the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, and we continue to be centrally involved in the strategic dialogue that Tamaika has set up, as well as a range of other activities involving civil society. Our Assistant Secretary, Michael Posner, does chair the Democracy and Human Rights Working Group within the strategic dialogue, and two of other senior officials in our Bureau, the Ambassador at Large for Religious Freedom, Suzanne Johnson-Cook, and our Special Advisor for Labor, Barbara Shaler, co-chair the Religion and Foreign Policy and Labor Working Groups within the Strategic Dialogue, respectively. So a lot of our principals within our Bureau are talking a lot about civil society and civil society engagement. And it's unremarkable for us to say that whenever our principals go out to the field, which they do often. Right now, one of our DASs, Tom Melia, who some of you may know, formerly of Freedom House, is in Afghanistan where he's meeting civil society. My Assistant Secretary, Mike Posner, is about to go to Libya where he will engage civil society. Basically, any place DRL goes, one of our obligatory events or stops is with civil society actors to hear from them exactly what their impressions are of the situation in their country and what it is that they think we should do to help them. As part of our involvement in the strategic dialogue, we're also committed to setting up a number of high-level engagements with civil society overseas. Most recently, we helped to organize a dialogue in Tunis in conjunction with the World Press Freedom Conference held there by UNESCO. We set up a dialogue between our Assistant Secretary for International Organizations, Esther Brimmer, one of our Deputy Assistant Secretaries, Kathy Fitzpatrick, and a number of journalists who were there for that event and had a very robust exchange on threats to freedom of the press and freedom of expression currently. We are also planning similar high-level engagements with civil society in Africa, which will focus primarily, we hope, on the rights of disabled persons, and in Asia, although the Asia stop has not yet been finally planned. In addition to these engagements, these dialogues with civil society, our Bureau is also actively engaged in supporting civil society organizations who may be under threat. In particular, at a Community of Democracies event last year, in the year anniversary of the Krakow speech that Tamaika referenced, we led the creation of an entity called Lifeline, which is a fund, a multilateral fund that has been set up to provide emergency assistance to NGOs who may be under threat. That fund has now received over $5 million in contributions from 14 governments and one private foundation, and to date has committed over $400,000 to organizations under threat or to advocacy campaigns. And we hope that that entity will grow. That entity is especially remarkable for the fact that a number of G77 countries have signed up to support the fund, not with huge contributions, but the fact that they have signed up to contribute to the fund we think is significant. But in addition to the phenomena that Tamaika has identified, both the growth of civil society and more recently the tremendous changes that civil society has helped to bring about in places like Tunisia, Egypt, and Yemen, we are seeing more recently a backlash against civil society by governments who are afraid of the very change that they have seen in Egypt and Tunisia. Since Egypt, in particular, undertook legal action against several NGOs, both U.S., foreign, and domestic, last December, countries as diverse as Russia, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Algeria, Malaysia, Kyrgyzstan, Venezuela, Vietnam, and Zimbabwe have considered or enacted new or additional restrictions on the ability of civil society to act. There's no doubt that many of these governments see themselves as vulnerable to widespread unrest by their populations who are dissatisfied with their closed political systems, corruption, or impunity. The pushback from these governments have come in many forms. Some governments, like Algeria, Pakistan, and Venezuela, have made or are considering making it more difficult to form an NGO. Others, like Malaysia, Belarus, and Russia, are more directly cracking down on rights to freedom of assembly and association. Still others are imposing new restrictions on freedom of expression, and including via the internet, to prevent citizens from communicating with one another in just the way that civil society organizations allow them to do. These types of restrictions are neither new nor unexpected. They are a common phenomenon during periods of democratic change. In a number of places, Croatia and Serbia come immediately to mind, post-authoritarian turmoil led to backsliding and similar hostility to NGOs. But the slow, tough slog towards democracy went on, and these groups and societies have emerged stronger. This backlash against civil society does not mean that positive change will not ultimately prevail, but it also does mean that it's incumbent on us in the U.S. government and all of you to remain vigilant and steadfast in fighting against such backsliding. In addition to the backsliding, though, there are some positive changes on civil society that I also want to highlight. In countries like Indonesia and Chile, it seems like ages ago almost, that they made their own transitions from authoritarian governments to democracy. We see civil society thriving and playing a key role in building and sustaining these new and vibrant democracies. In Cambodia and Yemen, the international community recently mobilized to support committed activists on the ground, which resulted in the postponement or withdrawal of laws that would have severely restricted civil society in both places. Most striking, perhaps, is Burma, where years of oppression against civil society and democratic forces now seem to be ending. It is crucial that we give these forces all the support we can to take advantage of the new opportunities there. So we must not lose heart or hope. These positive developments show that our support for civil society and the forces for democratic change can prevail. But in the face of the negative trends we are seeing currently, we must be fearless and persistent in standing with civil society organizations and the other forces for democratic change in order to maximize the chances for democratic progress. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Scott. Chris.
Good morning. Good morning.
Good morning.
Come on now. Thanks to Steve and the Wilson Center for hosting us, and to Tamika for the overview and his leadership of this process. It's really remarkable, as I'll lay out in a second. What I'd like to do in the 300 seconds that I've been allotted is three assumptions, three things that we've done or are about to do, and three things that I think we are likely to do at the Religion and Foreign Policy Working Group. Assumptions, facts. Ours is a track 1.5 world. And by that I mean change can take place from track 1, government to government, and it can take place from track 2, people to people. But track 1.5, where public and private, top-down and bottom-up meet, that's where sustainable change takes place. People-oriented solutions under good governance. to track 1.5, and this is the future. It's an age of amateurs and therefore requires a lot of humility as we engage it. Ours is also a religious world. 4 out of 5 people who walk the face of the planet believe in something greater than themselves. You have to work pretty hard not to see that fact from the embassy window. We've been pretty good at that sometimes, but it's a reality. And we have to engage it, and all the sectors of society, depending on which culture you're in, are sometimes viewed through the prism of religion, not just another sector to be addressed. It's important. It's important. It speaks to identity. It speaks to meaning. In an age of globalization that produces spiritual, psychological dislocation, it has even more meaning. The third assumption is this. The whole government thing isn't good enough. That's a starting point. I was on the staff when I was in the Marine Corps at the Pentagon of the National Defense Panel, which was set up to critique the first quadrennial defense review. And we used a phrase back then in the 90s called all the elements of national power. I think we need to recover that phrase because it's not just our government. And I think that this dialogue that the Secretary has set forth speaks to these 3 assumptions or facts as the world as it is and much needed, and it's long overdue. And we should be very grateful for the role that she has played in catalyzing that and then convening this process. And again, to Tamika for leading it. It really is unprecedented, and that's why I feel blessed to participate in it. 3 things that we've done as a religion foreign policy working group. One is that we get together. We've all been told not to talk about religion and politics in polite company, assuming you keep polite company. But that's what we're doing. We're getting together on a regular basis. We have 3 subgroups: religion and religious freedom and stability, democracy, religion and development, and religion and conflict prevention and mitigation. We're all theological stripes and none, all political persuasions. It's a little bit like the cantina scene from the first Star Wars movie. It almost makes the case for a God. But we're getting along. And that's remarkable. That is no small thing given the sensitivity of the topic and the times that we live in. We're creating a radical middle. And that is just absolutely critical that that is sustained and continues on. And it could go a whole bunch of ways, but for whatever reason, there is a strong rapport among all these people of different theological and political stripes to work on this. Without being melodramatic on it, it is the best of America, and it's powerful. The second thing that we've done is addressed the fact that our diplomacy and development efforts need some training on how to do religious engagement, given our predisposition not to talk about religion and politics. Religious freedom and religious engagement, to my cursory examination, those phrases are not mentioned in the QDDR. But now we're moving into doing training, and Secretary Clinton announced that yesterday, building on the electives that FSI, Foreign Service Institute, is already doing. And that's very, very important. The third thing that we're about to do, it's under legal review, is address where are the red lines? What are the things that really can't be done? That's really critical on this issue. Everybody has different versions and interpretations of the Establishment Clause, the First Amendment, and that has to be respected. But let's talk about what we can't do for sure, and then meanwhile enable what we can do as engaging the world as it is, where people of faith or no faith contribute to a flourishing society. So those are the 3 things that we have done. Here's where we're going. It comes up time and time again. If you're a religious actor or leader or any kind of civil society person, where do you go if you want to engage the State Department? Now, the State Department, as Tamika likes to say, has a phone number. You can call them, but then what? Where's the one-stop shopping? Where's the door that opens up and says, okay, this is where I can go? And then on the State Department side, where is that connection center that can be a clearinghouse and say, some NGOs are better than others. There's 60,000 of them, oh, by the way, and let's figure out how to work some of this and bring people into partnership. We've got to think that through. We've got to do that jointly and systematically, civil society with the State Department. So we're going to write up a white paper, and you'll probably see that as a recommendation by year's end. The second thing that we're trying to figure out is this. It's an age of amateurs. Where do we get the lessons learned on track 1.5? It's not just about America thinking about this. Other countries are thinking about this because it's reality. Where have governments and civil societies worked together on particular issues? How have they done that? What does that look like? Can we get those folks in the same room and have a lessons learned comparative analysis that would inform how we do our relationships with civil society and with global civil society? That has not been done to our knowledge either. And the third thing is this, because we've received plenty of inquiries from other governments and multilateral institutions about this process. What if there were strategic dialogues in other countries, other regions? And in our case, what if there was a religion foreign policy working group, say in Burma, with a multi-faith council that we could interface with? What if there was a regional working group on religion and foreign policy in Middle East, North Africa that we interfaced with? Imagine the lessons and the iron sharpening iron that could take place in such a context. So there's a quick overview, and with that, I will cede the floor to Elise. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you so much, Steve, for hosting us, and to Augusta, and also to Tamika for his great leadership. I'm absolutely honored to serve on the Secretary's Advisory Committee for Strategic Dialogue with Civil Society. Coming from an organization and working with women leaders over the past 15 years in 144 countries, I see every day the power of women's voice, particularly in civil society, and how, quite frankly, in many places it isn't being heard. But I think as Tamika laid out, things are changing, and those voices are beginning to be heard. And that's what I want to talk a bit about today, and then talk a little bit about what our working group around women is doing. So yesterday, I think we heard in the Global Summit of Civil Society Leaders, the Secretary reaffirmed, I think, a value that is extremely powerful, that effective American diplomacy in the 21st century must extend far beyond traditional players, really to non-state actors and, of course, to civil society. And one of the leaders standing there questioning the Secretary about her engagement in her country was a young woman from Yemen. She's a blogger. She's 26 years old. She's a woman who was actually called to the president's palace, the former president's palace in Yemen, and questioned about her work. This is a woman who says that in Yemen, the unthinkable happened. Women who have virtually no rights, and young people who feel totally disenfranchised, totally disempowered, basically brought down a dictator. She says that basically in Yemen there is a new normal. Women were out past 8 o'clock and the world didn't end. Certainly the world is shifting. I think that engaging civil society has always been part of our American foreign policy, but we've always thought about it very much as a tool of soft power. And I think what the QDDR has really done is institutionalized engaging civil society for the very first time as very much of a strategic, smart tool. You know, if you look around the world, and I think particularly in the Middle East, women have been frozen out from political power and decision-making positions. Particularly, this is true, I think, in Egypt, where women only hold 2% of seats in parliament, less than 2% of seats in parliament. So what women have done around the world, and particularly in the Middle East, is they've really began to consolidate their power as leaders in civil society. Recently, I was meeting with a group of women in Libya. There was no civil society, no political parties, for many, many years. And in the last year, many civil society groups have begun to crop up. 80% of those civil society groups are controlled and run by women. So I think where you can see where I'm going with this, as we see this shift towards working with non-state actors as critical part of our foreign policy, we're going to see a shift towards the voices of women, the power of women being tapped for the first time in history, and women really being key interlocutors in this work. I think there are a couple examples of the concrete benefits of working with women in civil society. And just to shift to another region of the world, although a working group has been focused on women in the Middle East, I want to tell you a brief story about women that we've been working with in Haiti for the last few years. I think the women there have felt, quite frankly, tired of being looked at as victims in their society. 2 years after the earthquake, they don't see much movement, much progress. Women hold less than 5% of seats in parliament. And so the women leaders that we work with in civil society decided to get organized. And they started going out throughout the country. This is actually quite unheard of. It's a very centralized country. Many of you who know Haiti know this. And they went out and began to hold focus groups with women all over the country, capturing how women feel that they can build positive solutions to the challenges that they face in Haiti, whether it be instability and security issues, violence against women, infrastructure, economic opportunities, or education. And we worked with those women to basically pull together the results from those 315 focus groups reaching men and women across the country and put together the country's ever first national platform for action for women. And this policy platform was then presented to the president. And the president and the newly appointed prime minister are actually using this as a roadmap for how they will not only engage and support women, but how they will actually find solutions to many of the challenges facing Haiti. So I think that's a very powerful example. Our working group is going to be focused primarily on women in the Middle East, and Josh is here from Milan Verveer's office if you have more questions about it. But just to talk about one element of our working group, and I think that at Vital Voices we've certainly seen the power of this, we're going to be forming a pan-Arab women's network because we recognize that right now change is beginning to happen in the Middle East for women, but it's happening very slowly. If you talk to women across the region, they'll say, you know, certainly some of our rights are being reversed, but at the same time, to go back to Shatha in Yemen, there's a new normal. We now know what it feels like to stand shoulder to shoulder with men in the square. We know what equality feels like, what it tastes like. We know now what we're fighting for. Our eyes have been opened. And I think that any way that we, as civil society here in the United States, working, of course, in close collaboration with our government, and also with corporations and the private sector, need to stay focused on helping those women achieve that new normal. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Lisa Shirk. I'm with 3P Human Security. And for the last 20 years, I've been working with civil society networks on the ground around the world with the Global Partnership for the Prevention of Armed Conflict and the Alliance for Peacebuilding, which have over 1,000 civil society organizational members doing work in different conflict-affected regions around the world. 4 years ago, when the Obama administration was moving into the White House, we wrote a memo to the Obama administration making 3 requests. One was for a review and greater support for development and diplomacy. The second was to open an office, a civil society liaison office, to better liaise and understand and listen to global civil society. And the third was to make conflict prevention a priority in U.S. foreign policy. And I'm really grateful to say that all 3 of those have been met, actually, those 3 requests. Actually, our task for the summer is to come up with new policy goals because the Obama administration has addressed so many of our concerns institutionally. However, we still have a long way to go, and I'm just going to play sort of the last person on the panel to outline some of these challenges. Dr. Tillman sort of outlined this 3-pillared approach, which we very much agree with, looking at places like Iraq and Afghanistan, Somalia, Kenya, Colombia. Really what we're trying to achieve is a citizen-oriented state, a private business sector, and an active civil society. And when all 3 of those components exist, we do get good governance, human rights, development, and security. But far too often what we see in too many countries is an elite-centered government, plus a private business sector, and really very little strategy or engagement with civil society. And what we see then is instability, corruption, and a lack of human rights amongst other problems. So in 2005, I was working in Iraq with some of our civil society organizational partners there, and they were so frustrated that they had no interaction really with the U.S. Embassy, with the provincial reconstruction teams. They didn't know who to contact. There was no interaction or communication. And that's when I came back to Washington after hearing this really for 2 decades of working in Latin America, Africa, across Asia, in Afghanistan, Sri Lanka, just many conflict-affected regions, there's this frustration that the U.S. foreign policy does state to state. We support states even when they are elite-centered, not when they're citizen-focused, and there hasn't been an engagement strategy for civil society. So having this new office is really tremendous because I think finally we have the conceptual framework to organize a foreign policy that does listen to civil society. I hear many things when I'm out working in conflict-affected regions in Iraq and Afghanistan from our local partners there who are running civil society organizations. They talk about pacification, the problems of being program implementers, and being invisible. So let me just outline these three really quickly. Historically, if we look at counterinsurgency, stabilization doctrine, it's very clear the language of pacification is there. And in Colombia, many of our human rights partners locally still talk about this pacification strategy being enacted, where they feel that their voices are silenced. Many of them are still kidnapped and killed by government agents in the paramilitary. There's a feeling still that civil society are the ones who raise the issues of critique of their government and point this out, and so there's a silencing of their voices. In other countries, in Somalia, Kenya, Ghana, all over West Africa where I've worked, people talk about the frustration of being program implementers. So they see so many donor programs from the US and many other Western countries designing those programs in the foreign capitals, and then they go searching for local NGOs to be their program implementers, but that their priorities are quite different. Their analysis of what is driving the conflict is quite different. And so there's this frustration of being seen as implementers of somebody else's design, about somebody else's program. And more recently in Afghanistan, there's tremendous frustration with the requests for proposals that are being written here in Washington that get filtered down to the field in Afghanistan, where local NGOs, local Afghan universities are like, why don't they listen to us on the front end when we're assessing the problem? And then the final part is this invisibility that I experienced in Iraq, where all these fantastic Iraqi NGOs who had been doing development, rule of law, good governance, reconciliation between tribal groups for decades. They are the experts in Iraq in these areas, and they had no input into any U.S. government policies or programs. Their voices, they were invisible. And when I came back from Iraq, I started attending military conferences and becoming very active in educating the U.S. military on civil society. And there's been tremendous openness there. And really, they had never even heard the concept of civil society. It's not in any of their doctrine, any of their handbooks. Very few people in Washington 5 years ago were using the term civil society. And there really was this invisibility. If anything, in Washington, we saw the international NGOs, but we didn't think about local NGOs, local universities, local labor unions, local religious organizations. In Afghanistan, we've been holding civil society, military, government dialogues, and this is the model that has been coming out of those dialogues, where in Afghanistan we have a counterinsurgency strategy and those civil society organizations, CSOs, which happens to also be the title of a new bureau at state, unfortunately. Those CSOs don't want to be program implementers in a coin strategy that they had no part in shaping or identifying. They feel very frustrated that their conflict assessments, which come up with very different drivers of what's driving the conflict in Afghanistan, that they're not listened to sort of at that front end of policy and planning. And so they want to have more consultation mechanisms, exactly now what the State Department is setting up, but really what needs to become much more robust, because when I'm out in Afghanistan, there's actually very few civilians. There's mostly civil societies interacting with the U.S. military. It's the same in East Africa, also in all over Latin America. The primary face of the U.S. is still the military, and that's who civil society is bumping up against. And there's not mechanisms for consultation, discussion, communication between these different branches of government with local civil society. The real challenge that civil society groups around the world identify is that their goals are different than government goals, whether it's US government or other Western governments, that civil society organizations are working for human security. Sometimes there's an overlap with national security, national interests, and sometimes there's not an overlap. And what we need to become better at here in Washington is to identify those tensions between national security and human security. So in Nigeria, a short-term national interest is the stabilization of the oil industry, and that means reducing the insurgency. And so therefore we sell weapons to the Nigerian government to repress the insurgency, but most of the civil society organizations in Nigeria talk about governance as being the key issue, and giving weapons to this government with these levels of divisions between North and South and the distribution of those oil revenues, it's very problematic. And they want a much longer term strategy that deals really with the root causes of what they see is driving insecurity for human beings, the human security element of this. There would be a way, I think, of shaping policy so that it also stabilizes the oil industry, but it takes a different point of view, and it really requires listening to Nigerian civil society, Muslim, Christian, Northern, Southern, all the variety of different civil society voices in Nigeria. So I'm talking about really democratizing policymaking. So democracy is both a means and an end. So we support democracy as a country by practicing it, by listening to civil society voices. And in many of the parts of the world where the interagency conflict assessment framework has been thoroughly practiced, in Liberia and the Philippines, people talk about it's public diplomacy. It's the government coming to listen to us. They're not coming to our village to deliver a speech, but they're going out there to listen to local people about what they see as driving the conflict and what their ideas are for addressing it, so that the people impacted by policies have an opportunity to shape those policies, resulting then in more consent, more legitimacy for U.S. policies. So the QDDR, conflict prevention, civil society, I think that we could do more going into the future to link these things, because the QDDR also made conflict prevention a priority. And many civil society organizations around the world want to do more about prevention so that we have civilian-led preventive diplomatic and development efforts so that we don't have a military response and reaction to crises. In order to do that, I think we need to listen to how local people perceive the drivers of conflict. So more specifically, linking the State Department's civil society and conflict prevention efforts, listening to local definitions. What does stability mean to the local people? What kind of stability? Because often stability means change. In Yemen, in Egypt, and many other countries, stabilization doesn't mean supporting the current government. I think we should mandate interagency conflict assessments in all conflict-affected countries, and I think we should really carry those out in a robust way that listens to local people and country-specific strategic dialogues with multiple sectors from civil society. I call this the whole of society approach, which is different than the whole of government approach. This is my last slide. So we really need to think about linking local civil society, international civil society, private sector government, military, international organizations, and thinking about how civil society gets in on the front end. They're not just program implementers, but they're seen as shaping U.S. foreign policy and having an opportunity to participate in its formulation and review its impact on them. And I have a chapter along with me from whole of government to whole of society. I left copies out in the lobby as well as a few here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lisa. Okay, thank you very much, panel. I think that was a really good start, and you've been very disciplined. We're left with almost a full hour for an exchange with the audience. So let me remind you about the webcast. So I'll start recognizing hands. You're welcome for comments and questions to pose to a member of the panel or to the whole panel, the panel as a whole. Wait for the microphone to emerge. There's the first question.
John Harbison from Johns Hopkins SAIS. I think the point I want to make, I can make by talking about Kenya. I know Lisa knows well. Civil society in Kenya was courageous, powerful, and effective in bringing about constitutional change in Kenya, as incomplete as it still is. At the same time, the evidence is that less than 10% of Kenyans have the first clue about what that constitution is. And so I think one of the issues here is what civil society can do, not just in conflict situations, but to deepen democracy by deepening democratic political culture. A lot of evidence around Africa that culture is pretty thin. And so my question really is, I think for the dialogue and for each of you who are part of it, is what is the dialogue? How is it focusing on that very important issue?
Thank you very much. We'll bundle about 2 or 3 questions together before we ask for responses. I think we will. Okay, right there.
Thank you. Carola Weil, USC Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism. I came in a little bit late, so I may have missed this, but I'm wondering about funding and the danger of unfunded mandates. I've been moving around the civil military world for many, many years in conflict prevention, and the biggest challenge that has dogged most of these efforts over decades and decades, and Lisa will know and Alice will know when it comes to thinking about the role of women in these areas, is there is no funding for this. It typically will go to the more traditional strategic views. We have been talking about human security being an element of national security for a good long time. This is not a new finding. And I just wonder whether there is anything new and different that will come in how resources are allocated so that the decisions about resource allocation is not driven by, say, with all due respect, the transitional teams put in by the military or by the Pentagon, but that they are in fact derived from budgets that are created at the civil society level. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We could take one more before we attempt some answers. We lull you all to sleep right here.
Thank you very much. Ann Phillips. I'm here at the Wilson Center. Thank you for your presentation. I have a question. I fully endorse the principle of more local partnership, more local ownership. We see that as you have identified, Lisa, projects designed in Washington don't really have traction. They don't have sustainability. When we leave, our money goes and nothing happens. But I want to ask you, especially with this profusion of civil society actors, when you go into, say, Afghanistan or Kenya or Nigeria and so on, and you talk to all these different groups, to what extent do you actually get a consensus on drivers of conflict, on priorities, 2 or 3, rather than an endless list of what we would like to have? You guys have all the money, so we've got 100 things that we desperately need here. So how is this working in practice to any of you? But since Lisa made the key point here about local input.
Okay, thank you. I think that gives us enough to get started, and we might as well start with Lisa on the last question on local setting the priorities and helping us define the drivers
Sure.
of conflict. Yeah.
And yeah, I'm working with U.S. government on how to do that better because civil society is diverse, so you're not going to get consensus. But I also point out that there's also not consensus in the U.S. government about our mission in Afghanistan, which civil society there points out that they hear something different depending on who they're listening to. Consensus is difficult. But many of the, let me take Kenya for example, many of the national networks of conflict prevention organizations, development, human rights organizations have been working together for decades, and they do have clear priorities that they have listed. So it's also important to figure out what kind of legitimacy do the civil society organizations have? Because it's important to do village-level listening to really diverse sectors of society, but then there has been some legitimacy in governance structures within civil society, national networks that do vetting, that do accountability, and their voices, I think, are really important to listen to because they have been working on these issues for a long time, and they have helped their members develop that consensus. So I think there should be more prioritization for some of those voices, while at the same time also listening to the diversity.
Okay, anyone else on that question? Elise or?
I can respond to that. I think the way in which we work at Vital Voices is very much, I think, it exemplifies a shift that I think we're seeing in terms of working with civil society organizations around the world. Vital Voices works in 144 countries around the world. We work with women in 144 countries. We don't have an office in a single country. People say, well, how do you operate? What we do is we search the world for leaders who have tremendous vision about what they would like to see, the changes that they would like to see in their countries. And then we look at how do we support them to take that vision to scale, right? So how do we stand behind them? Our philosophy is very much go into a country and work with women and sort of say, you're it. We want to support you and stand behind you. Not we're it and we have all the tools that you need to get there, right? And so I think that's a shift in philosophy. Just to, I think, bridge to the question around the unfunded mandate. Another shift I think we're seeing. Working in the women's space for over 17 years, when I was first in this space, I mean, it was so hard to get funding. We were mostly getting our funding when Vital Voices actually started as a U.S. government initiative and became a nonprofit. In 2000, most of it was coming from individuals who were just very passionate about women and from the U.S. government and other governments. What we've seen now is the private sector really coming into this space and recognizing women are this incredible untapped emerging market, more so than India, more so than China. Women are represented around the world, and we need to really tap them as this great economic force. I think what we're trying to do is really use that to figure out how do we tap women as a great civil society force, a great source to, obviously safeguard human rights. So how to really use this opportunity of more focus of corporations. Just to name a few, Walmart launched their 360 initiative, which is a multi-billion-dollar investment in sourcing from women entrepreneurs around the world. Many of you may know that only 1% of multinational corporations, 1% of their global supply chain comes from women-owned businesses. So Walmart sees this as a huge opportunity to double that and potentially do more. Coca-Cola, ExxonMobil, Nike, they're all developing these mega initiatives to invest in women. So I think there are some really profound shifts going on, and I'm very hopeful. Obviously, we need to do far more in this area.
On the tapping of local priorities, Anne, I might just add here that the work we do in Africa and several countries there in conflict resolution and peace building, we've had absolutely an overwhelming response from our local partners there in setting priorities and being very clear about what they thought the definition of the core causes of conflict and problems were. I think it comes quite simply to be sure we're always asking the question.
Can I just address the funding issue?
No, it's on.
It's on. This doesn't fully address your funding concern, but it partly does. As part of the QDDR outcomes, the bureau formerly known as the family of bureaus formerly known as the G family of bureaus, which included DRL, PRM, etc., was reconstituted as what's now known as the J family of bureaus. But there are two significant things about that impact the level of funding that can be dedicated to these sorts of issues. One is that a new bureau called the Bureau for Crisis and Stabilization Operations, the former SCRS, was created as a bureau, which sort of more formally institutionalizes the department's work on that issue. And while that bureau does not have a ton of funding, its creation as a bureau, I think, increases the likelihood that funding will be devoted to these sorts of issues. The other significant change is that the Bureau for International Narcotics and Law Enforcement, which had formerly reported to the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, the P family, if you will, has now been shifted under the J Undersecretary, so that they're up to $2 billion in programs for rule of law, police training, all that sort of stuff, is now part and parcel of the work we're doing on democracy building, human rights, civilian security, and the like. And so while that's not necessarily new money for these things, it's money that's being, in part, redirected towards these things or looked at in a new way as part and parcel of our engagement of civil society and our support for broader conflict prevention operations.
I can. One quick point on funding and then on the broader question of forging a democratic culture. A significant portion of what we're discussing today relates to finding new ways of doing business that are independent of where we actually allocate the resources. Getting together with civil society organizations and making them an integral part of our policy process remarkably doesn't cost that much. In fact, in many instances, it costs nothing at all. And so in that sense, funding is a question, but it's not the primary question. I do think it's important to note, though, that as we have worked to develop the 8 recommendations that have come out of the dialogue thus far, when I went in and sat down with our money people for the big uncomfortable conversation, not to reveal too much of the inner workings of the department, resources were not an issue at all. And that was, I think, a reflection of the fact that the leadership of the department, starting with Secretary Clinton, view our work with civil society as a priority, and we're eager to make this initiative succeed. Then on the issue of democracy support and building a democratic culture, it hasn't been a primary focus of this dialogue. However, I do want to note that another collaborative effort we have with civil society that was mentioned by both Scott and myself, the Community of Democracies, has made this a key priority. And there is a working group that's been established within the Community of Democracies, co-chaired by Mongolia and Poland, but populated by many civil society organizations as well, that working group is addressing this challenge through a number of different mechanisms. And it's another good example of how government and civil society can collaborate to address what I agree is a very clear and urgent challenge.
Chris, yeah.
May as well add 2 thoughts. One is, don't look at lack of funding as necessarily a great evil. You need it at some point. But sometimes it forces people to listen and really think through and discern what is needed and what the partnership is. Second, the way we work, we call it relational diplomacy. And Secretary Clinton spent a good deal of time yesterday at the Global Forum on the importance of relationships and how you affect change, particularly with key leaders. And I think that's key. And the point that I'd like to make here, though, is as you think about engaging civil society, take the time to engage the governments. Local government, provincial government, but also national. Our experience in East Asia is that there are just as many good people there who want to know and want to be equipped, but there's no point of reference. There's no point of reference for some of these things, and it's just as important to engage that. Finally, I do think, I think about NPR coming into Washington this morning, and you hear all the different foundations that support NPR, and there's government support. I mean, we have to fashion something like that for this. For example, this dialogue officially ends December 2012. It's needed. Where does it go in the next year? What kind of private-public arrangement can be set up such that it continues, and then it can also look at things where it could further work together to do things in the field. That has to be thought through.
If I can add just one quick point prompted by Chris's very good comment. One of the announcements that we made yesterday is that we will be creating a new global philanthropy working group within the dialogue that will be led by our Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs, Tara Sonnenschein, but the membership will be comprised of the heads of leading foundations that are committed to supporting civil society, and hopefully that can provide us with a platform for developing some partnerships going forward.
If I might add, also prompted by Chris, that very good point about engaging local governments. As Howard Wolpe and I went in to develop our post-conflict programs in countries like Burundi and DRC 10 years ago in Africa, we were very careful to engage the governments. But we found out in the end that also offered us a good funding source, because actually our first project in Burundi came through a World Bank grant that the Minister of Interior, out of their PSPR funding, urged the bank to give to us. So that's a very good approach. Okay, next round of questions. I see one right here in front of you, Ali, and then right at the back there, and then second and third.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you, all of you, for your presentation. My name is Nate Rosenblatt. I work at the American University of Iraq in Sulaymaniyah. My question is, in traveling around the region, and working with universities in the region, I was struck at how difficult it was for foreign service officers and embassies stationed, particularly in the region. I'm thinking, Lebanon, Iraq, and other places, in getting out of the embassy and getting involved with these local civil society organizations that we, talk so much about needing to engage with. So my question is, in the dialogue, has that issue been raised, and what sort of ideas have been brought to bear to sort of help mitigate that sort of difficulty? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, right at the back there.
Connie Freeman, currently with Syracuse University. I've spent some 40 years working on development issues in Africa, and I could not reinforce more the idea that nothing is sustained unless you have a sense of ownership, and you don't have a sense of ownership unless you have a role in initiating a process and planning a process. My last position in Africa was heading the International Development Research Center's regional office in Nairobi that was entirely staffed by African staff, and went out and supported research for development that was done almost exclusively by local African groups. One of our biggest challenges was to determine which groups were actually going to deliver what they said they were going to deliver, and to weed out ethically valid groups from suitcase NGOs, many of whom were created to, for instance, access the global funds for HIV/AIDS. And so this is, I guess, a comment in the sense of identifying what's often the elephant in the room. Let's work with local groups. Local groups know what's going on. It has to be owned by them. I agree. But local groups are not all totally committed to the cause, completely honest, and there's a real con game going on out there. And my recommendation is you work with local people to determine which local groups. But I'll be interested what else the panel might have to say to that.
Thank you very much. Down here first,
Serge Duss, International Medical Corps, international aid organization, and the community of which we are part represents the views of tens of millions of Americans through their support for our organizations. First of all, I'd like to say thank you to Lisa for providing a real dose of reality to this new initiative by the State Department and the administration. I'd like to focus my question to Dr. Tillman. If we look at the U.S. policy over the last 20, 30 years, the U.S. has seemed to always to favor hard power interests, strategic political interests, over the concerns of civil societies of those countries, and Egypt and many other countries in the Middle East. In Afghanistan, hard power took precedence over the views of American civil society and how the U.S. should operate in Afghanistan. And as Lisa has so well described, views of American civil society and Afghan civil society was almost completely ignored at the expense of U.S. hard power. Increasingly now in American civil society, more and more support for the political aspirations of the Palestinians, but the U.S. continues to ignore the views of American civil society and Palestinian civil society. So my question to you is, how will this new initiative change this debate and change how U.S. policy listens and actually implements the views of American and foreign civil societies?
Thank you very much. I think that's a good place to end the questions and start the responses, and we'll start with you, Damika.
Certainly, it's a good question, and one that we obviously spend a lot of time discussing. Let me disagree with the premise a little bit, if that's all right. I think it's unfair to say that historically hard power has always trumped soft power. We're a government at the end of the day, and like any government anywhere, one of our primary responsibilities is keeping our people safe. And that's nothing we should be ashamed of. It's something that's important, and as Secretary Clinton remarked on yesterday in responding to a question from a very brave Yemeni woman, there are individuals in many countries, including a number of the countries that you mentioned, that would like to see all of us dead, and they're not terribly interested in participating in dialogue, strategic or otherwise, because that's not on their agenda. And so we need to recognize the realities of the world we live in, and while we wish that all problems could be resolved through civil discussion and negotiation, unfortunately that's not the case. At the same time, the reason that we are here, the reason that we have the QDDR process that sets out this priority, is because we do recognize an urgent need to reorient our diplomacy around the goal of engagement with civil society. We do recognize a clear imperative to reach out beyond governments, to work with partners, not only what I like to call the STP, the same 10 people who get invited to embassy events over and over again because they have the right connections and speak the language, but really go out into communities, go out and meet with individuals at the grassroots level. There was another very good question about the allocation of funding. There's this wonderful term that's come out of the former Soviet Union that you may be familiar with, grant eaters. And too many civil society organizations do function as grant eaters. But we need to get beyond that and identify those groups that have real legitimacy with people and peers and that are doing excellent work. It's also important to recognize, frankly, that civil society is absolutely not a unified bloc. And I think it's very important to avoid the perception that somehow civil society has a unified view on any issue. Civil society is tremendously diverse, and it often doesn't agree with governments, including our government, and civil society organizations often don't agree with each other. And so we need to be careful not to oversimplify this. And civil society is like democracy itself. It's pluralistic. You've got a lot of different views, and we believe that the views that emerge from engagement with that diversity are going to be stronger and more durable, and that's why we're engaged in this process. But I think it's important to clarify that anyone who says that they are speaking on behalf of civil society is somebody who you should take with a big grain of salt, because if we're serious about what constitutes civil society, that's rarely, if ever, going to happen.
Elise, your name was taken in vain in the last question. Would you like to offer any insights on that?
I think it was you. No?
Do you mean me or her?
Elise.
No, I think they were talking about Lisa, but, but I can certainly comment, and I'll turn it over to Lisa to comment. I'd like to just share an example of a U.S. government initiative that I think started with a framework that was very much around hard power, but ended up being trumped by soft power. So many of you are probably familiar with the Trafficking in Persons report, which I know has been widely debated is the wise thing to do. I think if you know about it, it ranks every single country in the world. Now it ranks, I believe, the United States as well, in terms of how the government is doing, if they're doing a good job or not in tackling the issue of trafficking in human beings. And it threatens sanctions for those really at the bottom of the list. And, of course, no country likes to be at the bottom of the list. So it started actually very much sort of the stick rather than the carrot. But I think what has happened is that as all the U.S. embassies around the world have to report back to the Trafficking in Persons Office in the State Department and the ambassador, the current ambassador, Lou DeBaca, on how their country, their host country, is doing on the issue of human trafficking, they have to get that information from somewhere. So what they've been doing, the U.S. embassies have been doing, is they've been going to the local NGO community. Now, you can imagine when this TIP report first came out, 10 years ago about, no one was really, going to the NGOs. No one was really funding many of these NGOs. In many countries around the world, the police had no idea what human trafficking was. There was no word for it. So all of a sudden, there is all this focus and power given to the local NGO community. Well, very quickly, the host government figures out, the NGO, has all the power, and they start working with them. And so I think ultimately what the TIP report has done, whether it's effective or not, I believe what has been effective about it is that it has enabled it has given quite a bit of power to civil society organizations that had none, and it has created some very innovative partnerships between our local government, our government, the local government or host country, and civil society.
I wanted to comment on the security question because I think that the security of State Department officials going out to meet with civil society is a problem. I teach the course at the Foreign Service Institute here in Washington for Afghan civil society, so all the FSOs who are going over to Afghanistan. And most of them will never be able to leave the compound or the embassy where they'll be staying. So their strategies for engaging civil society are severely limited, and it ends up being those same 10 people and the grant eaters who take the risk actually to walk into the U.S. Embassy. And as somebody who is one of those people who goes back and forth between walking around Kabul without an armed guard, trying to fit in and be safe, and then making myself a target by walking into the embassy, it's dangerous for us, and it's dangerous for the State Department, because I then put a target on myself by saying I am collaborating with this government, and anybody who wants a soft target then to hit who's staying in a guest house that's not armed and walking around. It was the same way when I was traveling in Iraq. I was staying outside of the green zone, and it's tremendously dangerous for those of us who are trying to make a bridge and set up communication. And so, yeah, this is a real challenge about linking with civil society in many of these countries, is even the contact makes civil society a target that can be hit later.
Yes.
Just to reframe this just a little bit, because I think the fundamental question is, how can we be hard-headed and soft-hearted? Values and interest. If we live our values, we're going to take care of our interests. Government's got to kill bad guys before they kill us. That's part of the government's job. Americans need to steward the gift of their citizenship. It's a powerful gift. It's the most powerful country in the history of humankind. I think there's two ways to think about that, near term and long term. Near term is support what we're doing here. We're going to be making lots of mistakes, but what we're building is on-ramps to have the discussions and debate the questions that Serge has asked. We can only celebrate that. We don't have that space right now. We need the on-ramps to institutionalize a process through which input can be put in, and there can be a sense between suitcase and grant eaters and good people who have been vetted and cleared and can participate in the dialogue on a regular basis. And I say that as someone who's been to Hama, Banu, Vladikavkaz, Central Highlands of Vietnam, and never been asked for a brief, never been asked for any of my impressions. Not that I know anything, but I've been those places, and I know I'm way outside the embassy window. But now we have a chance to participate in that, and that's pretty critical. Now here's the long-term solution, because what we do as government, whether it doesn't matter what the administration is we create a special czar. So what? Special czar, and then it self-segregates. You think you've addressed the issue, but you've made it worse because you've just built a new silo. So the best thing that you can do over the long term is to create a common interagency curriculum at the entry, mid, and senior level that educates our people together so they can have a common worldview about what security is. And security is pretty simple. It's the 3 Ds: defense, diplomacy, development. Now, if you think that's too hard, this is exactly what took place in 1986 with the Goldwater-Nichols Act. It said you services, you tribes, military, Marine, Army, dogs, Air Force, wing wipers, Navy, squids, that's how I thought about them as I was raised up in my culturalization process. You're going to be educated together. When you're educated together, you learn how to think. Training is to a standard that's provided. Education is about critical thinking. And as you learn how to think critically, your stereotypes are reduced of the other. So I now have some of my best friends in the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force. Who would have thunk? From a guy who's the fourth of 8 Marines and 2 generations of disciples. We don't talk to those people. But the point is there's a common operating picture. And over time, that creates a whole new network of relationships that transcends silos, which is critical. And you create a common lexicon. That is what we have to do. It takes a generation. 86 to now is about a generation, and there is a joint culture. and you have to be joint educated if you want to get promoted. We need the same thing across our interagency that addresses these critical issues: peace building, reconciliation, religious engagement, all those things. If we address them individually, we've lost it.
Hey, Scott, anything on this? I just might add on this one, on the sort of the access question that you were bringing up, might have some insight. I think what Lisa just described is the situation of today that makes it, particularly in the Afghanistans, Iraqs of this world, extremely difficult for access to civil society. But I served as a young political officer in the American Embassy in Pretoria, South Africa from 1976 to 1980. Security situation quite different there, of course, but at a time when U.S. policy was not well liked by black South Africans. The American Embassy at that time was a very simple animal. We had one political officer covering white affairs and one covering black affairs. I was the one covering black affairs. So my mandate, my beat, was the black community, homelands, townships, and et cetera, where it wasn't easy going at all. First of all, just access, because of the perception of our policy as supporting an apartheid government, because it was a Cold War context. We saw them as a partner in that, and that made things very, very difficult. Second of all, because of the violence that was permeating the situation. I like to think we were pretty successful at it, and history has shown that we probably were, but it happened because of very close consultation and planning with the ambassador, with the state security officer, with around how we do this and how we make it work. And there's no simple answer, but in the end, I think we did get out in the community quite considerably, and were able to both serve our own purposes of testing and understanding what the community attitudes were, as well as begin to open up real dialogue with real leaders out there. So it's just a dialogue you need to have within the embassy community, within the broader State Department family. Okay, I think we have time for one more round of questions. I'd seen the first hand back there, Derek, and then this one here, and saw this one first and that one next.
Thank you, Howard Walker. My question is shaped by my experience, which I shared a couple of years later with Steve McDonnell, as being in the American Embassy 30-some years ago, and by my experience over the past 12 years of spending about 4 months a year in Cape Town, sometimes as visiting Fulbright professor at University of Cape Town in Stellenbosch, but others just enjoying that beautiful place. If there's one thing I learned from that perspective, is that today's dissidents, if they're successful, are tomorrow's governors or participants in government. And government requires, above all, a disposition to accommodate, to reach compromises, and to pursue policies that are not stovepiped, but societal policies, and ones that will bring development to the citizenry at large. Here's my question. To what extent is our government today seeking out NGOs and other civil society people who have that perspective rather than a very narrow, single interest perspective, and who seem like the kind of people who are mature and broad enough in their perspective to be governors when their time comes, that will govern that country in a stable way, pursuing policies which we think, and we have the right to have a position on this, which we think will be best designed to bring development to the country as a whole. And to what extent are we pushing this message to our contacts today among the dissidents, that that's what's required when you govern?
Okay, thank you. Second question here, Derek, right in the third row there. Yeah.
My name is Irving Rosenthal. I'm a professor at American University, but I worked for AID for about 40 years. And I guess the topic of civil society and everything that people have talked about is absolutely fantastic, because I can tell you we in AID have been doing this for 50 years. And therefore, the other part of this, I'm coming at this from a different point of view, about the QDDR, is the disaster that has destroyed what the U.S. government has been doing by turning this over now to State Department. The QDR has cut off AID's head budget and is now run by the State Department. And unless you guys learn what AID has been doing for 50 years, you're going to be discovering the wheel again. I've got a whole list, but I won't go over them. But you know, you talk about conflict mitigation. AID has an Office of Conflict Mitigation and Management that existed long before SCRS was created. I helped create the AID Women in Development Office 40 years ago, and it has been functioning, it has been learning, it has been changing the way it has been operating, and if, particularly Elise, if you haven't gone to the WIT office in AID to find out what they're doing, you're missing an awful lot. AID has had a democracy and governance office for another 30 or 40 years, and they have been functioning all around the world. Actually, I worked for that office when I did some work in the Eastern Europe. There are programs all around the world, and of course now State Department has created a new Bureau for Governance and Human Rights, which I don't think, from what I know, is taking any advantage of all of the knowledge that AID has. Actually, I'm talking to, I suppose, Mr. Tillman. But, you know, you talked about INR. AID has been doing local community police training for the longest time. And I don't think you're aware of it or have understood that there's a difference between national security and police training. Defense Department and State Department are concerned with national security. The AID people on the ground are concerned with local community development.
I think you are now going through your list, so
well, okay.
The question has,
all right. My
has been made
only
clear.
Point is that, you know, there's not a single person from AID on the panel. I know I saw in a list there's some people out here. With regard to the Woodrow Wilson Center, you're impartial. You're not on one side of that terrible battle that is now going on. Something must be done to take advantage of what we have known for years and make sure that our colleagues in State Department don't sit up there and just bang the table.
Thank you very much. We'll give some time to think about that one. The next stand I saw was here, and we'll do all three of these, and that's going to be the end of it.
Thank you. This has been absolutely fascinating. My name is David Alfer. I'm from CHF International. We're a U.S.-based non-governmental organization. The question I have is revolving around the idea of sovereignty and balance with the NGO community, because the greatest successes of development work, as with the greatest successes in community shift, have come through the use of engagement, of community activism, and that's one thing when you're non-governmental. I resonate with a lot of what Lisa has said. I spent a lot of time in the Red Zone in Iraq, and a lot of the contact that I was able to have was because I was non-governmental. But that contact takes on a very different kind of a tenor. There are some perhaps dangerous double edges to be found when it is a sovereign government interacting with somebody else's group of perhaps they're dissidents, perhaps they're activists. We're not maybe sure how that country sees them. And I think this process, as you're describing it, is fascinating, and it's necessary, and it's incredibly desirable to have. So my question is one of balance rather than of criticism, take it that way. Also a sense of protecting this process over time. Let's say there is a shift in our government come November. The NGOs have a history on the ground which is part of our interaction that's gone for a long period of time, and I'm wondering what you're building into this process that, if there is a shift, will allow this to continue and not simply fall off a cliff. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, let's. Okay, yeah.
I'm a professor from Zhejiang University, China. I have two questions. The first, as we know that the standard of civil society in Egypt are different from Libya. Is this decided the model of change in the two countries? Another. Now I'm studying American democracy assistance abroad. So I wonder, what will America do to promote the civil society development abroad? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And last question there.
Hi, my name's John Filson. I work for 3P Human Security. My question is for Dr. Tillman and others who would like to respond. First, just to say that I think any efforts, whether you're in government, outside of government, to understand people's needs and do something constructive for people in the world, in this country and other countries, should be supported and affirmed. And thank you for your work in doing that. We appreciate that. My question, I wonder if you would be able to provide us a little bit of insight into Secretary Clinton's mindset or attitude in proposing this strategic dialogue. I don't know if this session today counts as one of those sessions for in the strategic dialogue, but we appreciate the opportunity to talk with you and ask questions. In one sense, you can think of dialogue as an opportunity to change your co-dialogue partner, to change their views, to help them understand what you would like them to know. That's certainly how I approach conversations with my friends and family. I would, if only they could see my point of view, everything would be fine. But in another way, dialogue is an opportunity to listen, to gain a deeper understanding of the overall situation, and to be transformed oneself. And so my question is the Strategic Dialogue Initiative, the working groups around the world, the broader emphasis on civil society engagement, is this a plan to are we a program implementer like Lisa described, where an idea has already been hatched and we are to be participants in the interests of the State Department, or is this an opportunity? Is Secretary Clinton truly open to gaining a different understanding about what U.S. interests truly are, and to a degree democratize the policymaking process somewhat? I would love it if you'd be able to give us a sense of what she's actually thinking.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll use this as our swan song, so let's begin with you, Tamika, and go right down the line to Lisa at the end to answer any or all of those questions as you see fit.
Thank you. Well, you all have given us a great deal to respond to, and I will do my best. First, on Howard's excellent question about how we are seeking to identify civil society leaders and whether we are trying to find those with a broader perspective who aren't simply concerned about narrow topics. The short answer is yes, we work on that very actively. I was in Tunisia 2 weeks ago and made it a point to go outside of Tunis to smaller communities out in rural areas of the country and meet with the heads of very small civil society organizations, sometimes just one or two people, but who are trying to do good work that touches on a broad range of issues and are interested in developing the tools they need to help their country move forward and not simply advance a narrow agenda. This is a big challenge for the whole State Department. We spend a lot of time and, frankly, a lot of resources on trying to find those leaders because we know that they have the potential to do tremendous good in their countries. And we also have great programs like our exchange programs that are a mechanism for building relationships with those individuals. We've been very fortunate in my office over the last little while to have a representative from the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Exchanges, Augusta Babson, who's here today, who's done some tremendous work on this and is helping us to identify leaders who we can build stronger ties with. Irving had a very good question, and let me start by saying that at least as it relates to this initiative and frankly the work of my office, we have a spectacular relationship and partnership with USAID. We have just had a wonderful collaborative working environment together. Raj Shah sits on the Federal Advisory Committee for this initiative. This afternoon, Assistant Secretary Posner and I are going to be delivering testimony on the Hill together with Don Steinberg, the Deputy Administrator, about civil society issues. I speak with USAID's Dacha office on at least a daily, if not an hourly basis, and we have collaborated on dozens and dozens of initiatives. Obviously, there are challenges whenever you have two large agencies that are working together, but at least as it relates to this small piece of the puzzle, our collaboration with USAID is superb, and frankly, I don't know that it could be that much better. That may not be the answer you were expecting, but that's a very accurate representation of the work that we've done together. Shifting then to David's question about balance and institutionalization of this initiative, we are fortunate in one respect in that much of the work that we are doing is not partisan in nature. These are not ideas that are Democratic or Republican. These are very American principles, and trying to work with local partners, trying to strengthen those outside of government are not priorities that I think, based on many conversations with Republican friends and colleagues, are necessarily going to fall victim if hypothetically, from my standpoint, heaven forbid, there were to be a change in the administration. I think that these are ideas that are colorblind in terms of red and blue. And I'll say beyond that we've had excellent cooperation with many nominally conservative civil society organizations in our work in this dialogue. So we've tried to be very ecumenical in our outreach, and my hope is that if civil society organizations feel that this process is bearing fruit, then regardless of what happens in November, it will be perpetuated. On the questions that you raised, I'm going to defer to my colleague, Scott, who can speak specifically to what we do on democracy support, because DRL is a real leader in that regard. And finally, on Secretary Clinton's mindset, which is a great place to conclude, she, I think, recognizes that if this dialogue is to be successful, it will need to be about more than talk and will need to be about action. And fortunately, we're seeing that already. I've been very grateful for the opportunity to work closely with Secretary Clinton now for a number of years. And this is something that she feels very deeply. Her first job out of law school was in civil society. I think it's also important to note that President Obama's professional career began in civil society. So we have leaders in our country right now at the highest levels of government who haven't just studied this phenomena, they have lived it, and they understand it. They see the power and potential that resides in civil society, and they understand that if we are going to be successful as a nation, we need to reach out beyond government and take advantage of the tremendous well of energy and ideas that exists within civil society. That's what gave rise to this initiative. Again, I think if you go and read Secretary Clinton's speech that she delivered at the Community of Democracies in Krakow in July 2010, you'll get a very good assessment of where her heart is on these subjects, and also take a look at her comments yesterday, which were quite spectacular at our town hall with civil society. She's not speaking from talking points when she addresses this issue. This is something that, again, is deep in her soul, and she knows that no one organization, no one person, no one political party, no one government has the answers to the questions that we face in our countries. And if we are going to be successful, we need to take advantage of the diversity that exists within civil society and embrace that diversity in our diplomacy.
Okay, thank you. Scott?
Yes, also to address Howard's question, I would say that any good diplomat is one who is reaching out to those civil society actors with a broader perspective, not only with certain narrow interests they're trying to advance. So I mean, there's no formal criteria in the assessment, the evaluation of our diplomats on this issue, but I do think when you look at reporting from certain embassies, it is those sorts of individuals who are talking to the Nelson Mandelas of the world who are the ones who have their finger on the pulse, if you will, of who the next leaders might be. On the USAID State Department relationship, I also will echo Tamika's comments. I don't think it's as zero-sum a relationship as Irving depicted. The QDDR, of course, does stand for the Quadrennial Diplomacy and Development Review, and I think one of the objectives of that review was not to elevate the State Department over USAID, but rather to recognize these as two equal and equally important pillars which need to be better married up to ensure that the U.S. government as a whole is effectively advancing our interests in our foreign policy and our programming overseas. And yes, there are bumpy spots in the road because the two agencies are both active overseas, have staff overseas, have programs overseas, but I do think the QDDR process, along with the development presidential policy directive that was issued a couple years ago, have sought to better unify the work of these two agencies rather than pit them against one another. Then, in response to the question from our Chinese friend, yes, we are, my bureau as well as AID and other bureaus within the State Department are providing funds to civil society. Indeed, as Irving pointed out, we've been doing it for many, many years. I do think the ways in which the Secretary and the President have highlighted this issue have caused us to provide perhaps slightly enhanced amounts of funding to civil society than has been the case in the past. But it is something the United States has done for a very long period of time, and I suspect we will continue to do regardless of the administration in office. I'm not sure I fully understood your first question about Libya and Egypt. I would say that there's no one model that we look to in terms of civil society organizations that we wish to export globally. Rather, I would say we go into each situation looking for civilian actors who care about issues in their country and are trying to do something about them, and try to work with them on their own terms rather than come into any situation and say, gee, the Libya model is the one that should be applied elsewhere. I would note on Libya in particular, as virtually non-existent civil society in Libya under General Gaddafi. And one of our challenges there is helping Libya develop a robust civil society which can help it become a sustainable democracy over the long term.
Chris?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks to Professor Irving and Ambassador Howard for your long service to our country. That can't be said enough. A bunch of thoughts. One is both of those comments made by these servants of our country speak to how you bring lessons learned together and then how those lessons get taught. Another need for an interagency curriculum mandated top-down, shoved down people's throats to say we're going to be educated together and think about this together and not have competing silos of conceptual thought. It has to be done. It's okay to have different perspectives, but we have to be educated together to think about this stuff. On the point of dialogue gets a bad rap sometimes. Touchy-feely, hop, skip, and go naked, go hug a tree. But no talk, no trust. No trust, no tangibility. It's really that simple. The question, the strategic question, though, is who stewards and who manages the relationships over time. Civil society, governments overseas, they see different Americans coming through, especially in places where our troops are. I've given this brief 10,000 times, just a different American wearing the same uniform. They want to know what that looks like, and we need to be better at that. Where are the relationships managed? And where's the single point of contact where they can continue to come back to? That might be a role for a place like a Wilson Center or a nonpartisan, semi-government funded third-party entity that can be in charge of that for a particular region and or issue. We're terrible at relationships, partly because we're terrible at listening, but because we have no money, now we're listening. So let's think about what this means. The last point that I would make, and this goes back to the ambassador's comment, there's a new generation of Mandelas out there, but even if they were to succeed and there was to be some sort of democratic revolution overnight that we would recognize and feel tremendously comfortable with as Americans, somewhere between 70 and 90% of the government personnel, rank and file, would probably be the same people. Engage them now. Don't treat them as a stereotype or civil society as a stereotype or as a monolith. There are good and bad people in both places, top down and bottom up. And when the transition comes, the majority of the rank and file will still be in power, and they will be in a position to act out what was in their heart, but they couldn't and wouldn't be able to say until that point in time.
Okay, Elise.
Sure. You know, I think in closing, I'd like to address the issue of sustainability because I think that's an important one. I worked in government now at an NGO, and I think one of the things that I've looked at over the years is the sustainability of focus on women. And I think one of the things that I absolutely applaud Secretary Clinton for is inserting very strong points around women into the QDDR. I think that as we move forward, though, if there was a change in administration, I really don't think a new administration would have a choice but to continue to focus on civil society, because that is the shift in terms of the powers of the world. You know, I'm in the business of leadership, have been for the last 15 years, and no time in history have we seen more of a shift in terms of where leadership lies, or where power and decision-making and change ultimately lies. For so long, it was just about the person at the top with the title, with the position, and it shifted. It's now also about the networks of people at potentially even the bottom, at the grassroots. And so I think any government, you know, and certainly it's not a partisan issue, any government has to recognize that. And I think that, you know, Secretary Clinton is extremely forward-looking and, quite frankly, forward-leaning. You know, I think that she takes some pretty bold risks to say civil society is a critical, but not just sort of soft, nice, you know, to engage with, but strategic. And, you know, 2 years ago, that was, you know, that wasn't, I mean, as I think Tamika laid out so well, I mean, that, you know, that was not necessarily a concept that everyone embraced, but I think people are beginning to realize it is the only way forward.
I'll close also on the sustainability question because I think the infrastructure for ongoing civil society-state relations will need a permanent office and not just a one-year strategic dialogue. So I really hope that we can move into pushing for that permanent point of contact, because that is what has been missing in so many parts of the world. And I think fundamentally, though, that the three-pillared approach of seeing civil society alongside citizen-oriented states and the private sector is transformative of our national interests as well, because it says that democracy and freedom are the priorities. And so sometimes states that are not citizen-oriented, you know, there's going to be sort of, we're going to be listening also to the civil society activists who are challenging their states. And I think that fundamentally changes our foreign policy if we really do that. So I hope that happens.
Okay, thank you very much, all. Let me bring this to a close then and start by thanking you, the audience. Obviously, a party is only as good as the people who come to it, and you've been a very good and very informative audience yourself. And then thank this wonderful panel.